Welcome to the 11th lecture for International Regulatory Frameworks for Climate Change and Environmental Management. So this is our last substantive lecture, and we're going to cover the UN Sustainable Development Goals and Paris Agreement 2015. So in outline, I want to actually start. One of the things I've kept saying through our discussions is you guys could be part of international negotiations in the future. I want to talk about participating in international negotiations to personalise it for you. So I really want to emphasise that for you. It's certainly something that can be part of your future. Talk about the current international regimes running. So we've been talking in the last few lectures about climate change, but I just want to remind us that there's all these other regimes that are also going on at the same time. And that new regimes are also still being created. I've said that since 1990 all the major pieces have been in place, but there are still environmental treaties being negotiated. The Minamota Convention on Mercury 2013, just in the last month we've got the TPP 11, another trade regime still being negotiated, and so there's an ongoing process of evolution. Wanted to emphasise that. Mentioned the UN Sustainable Development Goals, which were passed by the UN General Assembly in 2015, and they actually provide a really good reference point for you if potentially for research topics. So the SDGs, an important part of the international policy mix at the moment. And then look at the Paris Agreement and the most recent COP in Bonn, implementing it. So and then look into the future. Where are we at now, and what is the future going to hold? I'm also going to mention too the new international crime of ecocide that's pushed by Polly Higgins. So context won't dwell on this. We've talked about it in earlier lectures. So we're just basically saying in the last 20 years, all the major pieces of international environmental regulation have been in place. From the Rio conference in 1992, the UNFCCC, climate change has been a massive issue, a lot of problems with implementing it, and all of these other issues that have been going on the last 20 years. So won't dwell on that. What I want to emphasise though at this stage is that until this point, we've been really looking at what's happened in the past and looked at the story of the evolution of international environmental regulation since 1945. Now I want to take us from looking in the past to switching and looking at the future, because that's where your careers are going to be. It's not the value of learning the history of all of these international regimes isn't for the sake of some dusty textbook. It's for what it can help you with and help you achieve in your careers. So international environmental regulation is going to be really important for you. Emphasise whether you know it or not. It's important for you in actually protecting you every day of your life. But also in any career in environmental management, there are a whole range of international environmental issues that bubble along, climate change being a huge one. So what will the future evolution of international environmental regulation from now, let's just say to 2050, what's it going to look like? Okay, first of those topics that I wanted to discuss was participating in international negotiations, and I've shown you this picture of Beatty, lovely lady from Malaysia who was in this class a few years ago, and I'd explained that she'd given these pictures of her at one of the COPs for the UNFCCC when she went as part of the Malaysian delegation. So looks a lot like you guys. And I really want to emphasise, that you can participate in these things. A really good reference that I'd highly recommend, I've made it available on the Blackboard side, was produced by the Foundation for International Environmental Law and Development in the UK, or FIELD. and it's help for multilateral environment agreement negotiators, MEAs, who encounter problems, a field guide. Produced a few years ago. Great little reference though, it's very practical. It's written, you know, for people going to negotiations, deals with, you know, the sorts of things to expect about the program, preparing for going, and then being there and, you know, encountering problems like difficult negotiations. So it's a very practical reference. As I say, it's available on the Blackboard site. Go and have a flick through it. It's an interesting, just to look at that. But I want to relate a story from another student of this class, Carol, who was from Zambia, and she was doing her masters here at UQ back in 2013, and she actually worked for the Zambian Environment Ministry for Lands and Environmental Protection in Zambia. And she had participated in quite a few international negotiations. So this is Carol in 2009 in Bonn, going to a climate meeting. And this is her with a colleague in Switzerland. Her role at the time when she was actually here at UQ, and she'd go off to, you know, international negotiations and come back to keep doing her masters, was she was heavily involved in the Green Climate Fund that was being developed at that stage. So she talked to the class, and I grabbed this slide from her because she talked about your likely reactions at your first international meeting. Excitement, intimidation, confusion, being overwhelmed, and then exhausted. There's the classic, you know, so thousands of people descend on a city, there's complicated negotiations going on, difficulties in reaching agreement, and then the classic thing is that they end up in the last few days working through the night, you know, getting no sleep or very few hours of sleep. Maybe they extend the deadline to try and push and, you know, get the final agreement through. So the participants often end just completely exhausted, and, you know, agreement might be reached because simply no one can fight anymore. You know, they just work themselves to a state of exhaustion. So all of those feelings are really common. This is another student, Luanda from Zambia, at one of the COPs, COP17 in South Africa, and that was her minister appearing, really cool looking minister. And this is some of her colleagues. So, you know, a room very much like we're in now, you know, or that you'd see here at uni. There's nothing, you know, unique or special about the people that go to these meetings. They're not just, you know, the Barack Obamas, it's not just plenary sessions, there's a huge amount of work. Thousands of people go to them and participate. And a lot of just, you know, relatively low-level administrative work. So if you go to negotiations, the major administrative bodies, I just mentioned them, we talked about some of them earlier. So the Conference of the Party we know about, the Meeting of the Parties, the Secretariat is the, you know, the administrative body for the convention. A range of advisory bodies can provide, you know, scientific advice, and there'll be different negotiation streams. So in climate negotiations, there have been two major negotiation streams. One was the ad hoc working group on long-term cooperative action under the convention, and another was the ad hoc working group on further commitments for Annex 1 under the Kyoto Protocol. So yeah, you can have different streams, lots of side meetings. Regional groups can be important, the EU particularly, because of its leadership role and because it acts as a bloc. You know, it's got quite a lot of votes, but there's also a lot of money in it. And then there's other regional groups like there's Southern Common Market for South America, ASEAN. They're not anywhere near as strong as, so obviously the EU, Mercury, Mercosur, and ASEAN. But apart from the EU, the Mercosur and ASEAN really aren't strong in working together. The more important voting blocs to be aware of is particularly the G77 in China. Talked about this, I think, back in lecture 1. So G77 in China was, when it was originally founded in 1964, it had 77 members. It's now got over 130 members, and it's still called the G77. It's a major voting group within the UN generally, but also in climate negotiations. And within that, subgroups, the African group, AOSIS, has been really significant in pushing. So these are all the small island states that are often quite poor, but they're also highly vulnerable to sea level rise. So they have been the most vocal, the most active in pushing for strong action, and they were what drove the reference to 1.5 degrees in the Paris Agreement. So AOSIS is important, countries like the Maldives, the Marshall Islands and the like. LDCs as well, least developed group, least developed countries. The EU, and then there's some other weird ones. The Umbrella Group is a loose coalition of 8 non-EU developed countries, Australia, Canada, Japan, New Zealand, Norway, the Russian Federation, Ukraine and the USA, like just a weird assemblage of them. But the Umbrella Group, the Environmental Integrity Group, Mexico, Liechtenstein, Monaco, Republic of Korea and Switzerland. You know, you've also got other sort of groups like OPEC and the like, so a whole range of different groupings, but really the one to be aware of is the G77, say AOSIS, European Union. So yeah, G77 members, the Chinese government is obviously instrumental or very important in the G77. And has been just a key player in climate negotiations for the last decade, particularly. So voting blocks are important, but the UNFCCC works by consensus. So if any one country of the 195 countries that are parties to the agreement or the UNFCCC, if any one country wants to vote no, then a resolution can't be reached. So you'd think that's an obvious problem, isn't it? Like, how are you going to get unanimous agreement? Well, one thing to be aware of in terms of the reality is countries don't like to be seen to be isolated. So once you get down to just a few remaining, they don't want to be seen as the last one holding out. So countries like Saudi Arabia have been infamous for basically delaying a vote. So delay, disruption and frustrating negotiations is a common tactic. So if a country doesn't want something to be resolved, instead of letting it get to a vote, you basically just try and hamper the progress. Not all countries negotiate in good faith. Some are there to disrupt and delay and protect their interests. So this is a quote from a fellow from the Paris Agreement. Saudi Arabia is traditionally known as an obstructionist in the climate talks. Its delegates have lived up to the reputation at Paris, COP21. Bracketing texts, we put square brackets around it, suggest that the wording is up for deletion or at least disputed. The Saudi negotiator will often briskly walk into a negotiating session, bracket some text, question the procedures, engage a little thereafter, and leave before the session is closed. Stalling tactics and bracketing numerous paragraphs across the agreement have been used to slow the negotiations to a snail's pace. So, negotiations in bad faith. So yeah, ongoing climate negotiations are occurring in parallel with other international negotiations. This is a point I wanted to emphasise. It might be obvious because we've been talking about things like the World Heritage Convention and the Biodiversity Convention and the like, but I just wanted to emphasise it. So emphasising right now climate, but there's all these other things going on. So we talked about the CBD and things like, you know, COP10 of the CBD in Nagoya. In 2010 came up with a set of principles. There's things like Rio Plus 20, whole range of things that are ongoing. So there's no one, you know, climate isn't the only show in town. There's all these other regimes still ongoing. There's also new regimes evolving, so an example being the Minamota Convention. So why is it called the Minamota Convention? What's Minamota famous for? Something to do with Mercury? Be a good guess. So where is Minamota? It's a city in Japan. And why is the name of the convention? I'll tell you, it's not because the convention was simply signed there. There was a reason why it's named the Minamota Convention, other than where it was signed.
There was pollution?
Yes. So it's a city famous for, there's a factory that was basically pumping waste into the ocean. Mercury was in that waste, and it polluted the seafood of the area, and incredibly sadly, many children in the city were born with horrible birth defects linked with mercury poisoning from their mothers eating seafood. So there were a lot of birth defects, and there was a famous story about the when there were concerns about the waste and the birth defects and linking to the factory, the CEO of the company famously came to the waste outfall and took a cup and drank from the waste outfall to show how clean it was. It later emerged, though, that they turned off the waste for that day and they were pumping out pure water. So it was just a deceptive tactic from the company. So Minamota is famous or infamous for the birth defects caused by mercury. So that's why the convention is named after Minamota, not for where it was signed. It may have been signed in Minamota as well, but it's actually linked to the city that's famous for that. So, won't go there. The Trans-Pacific Partnership. So that was just announced. So history of that. Barack Obama was pushing for the TPP, the Trans-Pacific Partnership, in his final term, second and final term. And it was an agreement. So what was it about? We've already got things like GATT, and why do we need another trade agreement? So what was the TPP about? Led by the US, obviously in the Pacific. Who wasn't invited? China wasn't invited to be part of it. So it was basically an attempt by the US to take away from China's role in the Pacific and really bolster US influence. So that's what it transparently was. So when there was a lot of negotiations in secret, and then last year, was it? Just before Trump was elected, a text was released of it, what was proposed, and it had a chapter on environment, but the chapter on environment was just completely hopeless. It just basically referred to a series of obligations under already existing conventions and said, and we will implement those. So it did nothing on environment. It was really seemed to be driven by US large pharmaceutical companies wanting to basically protect intellectual property rights in drugs, particularly. So that was an agenda by the US government. But it also had what are called investor-state dispute instruments, which basically allow corporations to sue countries if a country makes a decision or passes a new law which affects the investments of that company in the country. And so those investor-state mechanisms have been really controversial. And I've put a link here to a story on to fast forward, I'll come back to the investor-state mechanisms, but when Donald Trump came in, and he's all about ripping up international agreements and being the claim that he makes that he's this great negotiator. He's with all these trade deals like NAFTA, the North American Free Trade Agreement and the like. They all have been really bad for the US, and he's going to rip them up and basically negotiate better deals for the US. So he basically said, well, they're not going to go ahead with the TPP. Well, no tears from me. It was a bad agreement anyway, in my view. But the other countries, so lacking now the US leadership, other countries that had already invested in the process said, basically pushed ahead. And just, so November 14th, this story was from, TPP 11 was released. And yeah, basically it suspended a number of provisions of the original TPP, including the environment chapter, but there was nothing in that anyway. And this was a range of experts on the conversation responding and saying, basically there's some improvements, but there's still a lot of bad things in the TPP. And talked about particularly the, you can see here Pat Ranald speaking about TPP 11 retains all provisions on investor-state dispute settlement, except for some narrow improvements. So yeah, basically those investor-state dispute settlement provisions are really problematic because they allow corporations to sue countries, but not in a court system. They typically set up an ad hoc panel of arbitrators that rule upon it. So, and one of the huge problems with this mechanism is that those panel members might be, just lawyers from, involved in these sorts of trade disputes all the time. So, someone who's a panel member might, in 2 years' time be working for one of the countries. So there's no, whereas court systems, one of the basic safeguards that we have is you appoint judges and you typically appoint them for life, so that there's no, they don't have any interest in, like we appoint judges for life so that when the government is one of the litigants, it's not like the judge has to curry favour with the government because they want to be, re-elected as a judge. I know the US has a system where judges can continue to be elected, but in most countries, judges are appointed for life. And it's to basically ensure that they're completely independent. There's no benefit for them in deciding one way or the other. So this mechanism just, does the opposite of that. You basically set up these panels where the people on them that are making the decision have a real interest in potentially deciding in favour of, the corporations, and they're not subject to review in the court system. So there's a lot of concern about these things. So the TPP 11 is proposing those sorts of things. Yeah, I'm firmly against it. I don't see any benefits for Australia. I see a lot of disbenefits in it. But our current Australian government is really, keen on pushing its trade credentials, so bilateral trade agreements and the like. It's not pushing any environment things. That's why, there's nothing strong environmentally in these agreements. Does anyone have any questions about that? Or the main point I wanted to emphasise is that with this is not so much the TPP 11, but just that there's these ongoing negotiations. It's not like, international environmental regulation is just settled and isn't changing. It is constantly changing. One of the things I've tried to do on the Blackboard side is keep putting up stories that are relevant to international environmental regulation to emphasise that it's an ongoing process, that it's relevant in a lot of different contexts. So this is just an example of a recent development that's really relevant to international environmental regulation and some of the emerging problems with overall international governments. And yeah, investor-state dispute settlement is one of them. It's a real problem because it's often pushed by, particularly the US, driven by large corporations who want to be able to sue countries. Yeah. and then, you know, effectively be able to blackmail small countries particularly, you know, don't change your law and, you know, ban such and such a product, because if you do, we'll sue you. And, you know, we'll get damages for, you know, $1 billion. And so, you know, you can come up with big numbers quickly, and potentially, you know, countries start to not enact safeguards because they fear being sued under these sorts of provisions. So I really wanted to mention the UN Sustainable Development Goals. So they were adopted by the UN General Assembly in 2015, so 2 years ago. So they were adopted by the General Assembly. So think back to Lecture 1 and tell me what that means legally. They're non-binding. Yep. So they're adopted by resolution of the General Assembly. I think they were adopted unanimously, but that doesn't have any legal effect. UN General Assembly resolutions are non-binding, but if they're non-binding, what's their value? Are they valueless because they're not legally binding? So tell me why they're valuable. Reputation? Yep. Is it? Yep. Countries don't like to be seen to be, you know, they like to be seen to being good corporate, not good corporate, Freudian slip, good global citizens. So, you know, a country like Australia, it prides itself on being on its reputation. Countries like Japan, they pride themselves. China pride themselves on their reputation, being seen as being a good international citizen. So participating in these and you know, there's a reputational element to them. And they're important guides. So it's classic soft law, it's non-binding, but it gives you important policy guidance. And often countries will adopt policies to achieve them, even though they're not binding. So really valuable from that perspective. And it set up 17 goals and 169 targets. This is just one of the you know, visual representations of those 17 targets. So you can see there, no poverty, zero hunger, good health and well-being, quality education, gender equality, clean water and sanitation, affordable and clean energy, decent work and economic growth, industry, innovation and infrastructure, reduced inequalities, sustainable cities and communities, responsible consumption and production, climate action, life below water, life on land, justice, peace and strong institutions, partnerships for goals. Looks a lot like my tree, doesn't it, with a fruit, except not in a tree. So outcomes that we want to achieve, not just about environment, but environment is there. Okay, I just want to give you one example. So you can go and look at them all, but let's just look at one example. Can you guys read that, or should I close the blinds? Sorry? Is that okay? Okay, so this is goal 14. Conserve and sustainably use the oceans. Oh, can I just, before I go on to goal 14, so for your research topic, this is a definite legitimate area of research, okay? So you could look at, if you are not particularly that interested in like a natural environment issue, like if, you know, energy is, well, energy, you could just use climate change, but, you know, if you're really interested in social well-being, or you want to look at broader public health things, you know, this could be an easy, or you're interested in, you know, international development, those sorts of things. This could be a really good reference point for you to look at evaluating the effectiveness of an international regulatory framework. I certainly would include the UN Sustainable Development Goals. And in terms of the significance of it, like, so one of the things you're judged on for your research topic is the significance of your research. So if you were looking at general sustainability, I mentioned you could use Agenda 21 from 1992, which sort of fell like a stone and sank and hardly anyone knows about now. or you could use the UN Sustainable Development Goals as your point of reference. In thinking about the significance of research related to either of those topics, which would be more significant? If you related to the Agenda 21 or the UN Sustainable Development Goals? Significance, its importance, its relevance, which is more significant? Research associated with the Agenda 21 from 1992 or the UN Sustainable Development Goals from 2015, which are the major impetus for the global community right now and sustainability? Obviously, yeah, obviously, like it was meant to be a really obvious, like in terms of significance, you would choose the UN Sustainable Development Goals because they are now the international, the UN adopted them unanimously a couple of years ago. They're agenda setting, they're highly relevant, they're important. So they're significant. So research associated with their implementation and making policy recommendations for how their implementation can be improved is significant. It's important. It has, public importance. So you could use any of these. So just as an example, Goal 14, the goal is to conserve and sustainably use the oceans, seas, and marine resources for sustainable development. And then it has a series of paragraphs. By 2025, prevent and significantly reduce marine debris of all kinds, in particular from land-based activities, including marine debris and nutrient pollution. And then just 14.5, by 2020, conserve at least 10% of coastal and marine areas consistent with national and international law, based on the best available scientific information. So, Goal 14, compare Goal 14 to 14.5. What's the difference between the overall goal and 14.5 particularly? What sort of differences can you see? Yeah, so 14.5 is quantitative. You've got a time, you've got at least 10%, so it's, whereas the overall, you can see the overall goal is qualitative. There's nothing particularly measurable in it. Conserve and sustainably use the oceans, seas, and marine resources for sustainable development. It's really vague what that actually means. Whereas 14.5, you've got a specific time frame, you've got a specific minimum amount, and then, there's a bit of vagueness about the rest of it, but it's more quantitative. So the more specific and quantitative, the more measurable it is, and therefore the easier it is to evaluate the effectiveness of it, whether you've achieved it or not. Okay, so that's an example of goals. I actually wrote a chapter for a book last year, I think it was, on use of objectives in policy instruments, and I used the UN Sustainable Development Goals to basically look at how often policy documents will have hierarchies of objectives. So you have a broad, like if I go back here, you have broad, simple, easy to communicate objectives like 14, life below water. Easy to communicate, people understand what you mean by that. And then, so for public relations, those things like the Clean Water Act or the Clean Air Act in the US, just from the title, you get what they're about. And who could object to, clean air or clean water? So there's an important public relations element to goals, but then often, for implementing policies, you need them to be measurable and have indicators, and that's why you get down to more detailed, having a time frame, having numbers in them. They become more detailed. So the UN Sustainable Development Goals are an important high-level agenda for the UN. So here's Ban Ki-moon, then the UN Secretary General. So I just want you to be aware of them. They're an important high-level objective right now at a UN level. And they're setting, there's the sustainability plan to 2030. So, if you guys go and work for government somewhere, particularly in developing countries, then these sustainable development goals are the sorts of things that you can use as a reference point for policies, for aligning your what you're doing within government departments with what these goals are and how your country is achieving them. So a really important reference point to be aware of. Okay, so that just brings me on to current negotiations for the UNFCCC. So we've got all these other things that are happening. We've got the UN Sustainable Development Goals and the like. So I just want to look at the last few years. So we looked at the Kyoto Protocol. In an earlier lecture I said, asked the question, why did countries wait until 2009 before trying to agree what would come after the first commitment period? And said to you that one of the big reasons was because of the state of US leadership or lack of leadership under George Bush, that the US was basically trying to delay, had refused to ratify Kyoto, and Europe particularly was waiting to see who would come after and hoping, crossed fingers, hoping that they would get someone better. So in 2008, Barack Obama was elected, and the world breathed a sigh of relief, and there was a huge hope that had been leading up to, delaying, but they couldn't really delay any longer. They needed to find agreement on what would come after 2012 when the first commitment period expired. The COP in that year was COP15. It was to be held in Copenhagen, Denmark. And sure it was a horrible failure on many levels. From the administration, it was winter time in Copenhagen, and people tell there were lots of stories about because also terrorism was a major concern, so there was a lot of ID checks to get into venues, and they tell of these massive lines of people standing basically in the snow, waiting for hours to get into venues, that there were so many people there. I think there was 15 or 20,000 people basically trying to pack into these halls, which just couldn't cope with the numbers of people. So people being turned away, couldn't get in. It was just a schmozzle. Very acrimonious. So in the lead up to that and surrounding the negotiations since Copenhagen, as I said, there have been other streams. I mentioned the ad hoc working groups. So there were all these, apart from the COPs each year, there's in these big complicated conventions, they can be having regular meetings of streams to try and resolve things to then come back to the COPs. So this was the 14th session of the ad hoc working group on further commitments for Annex 1 countries under the Kyoto Protocol, and the 12th session of the ad hoc working group on long-term cooperation action under the convention, taking place in October 2010 in China, and it was the last preparatory talks before the 16th COP in Cancun. So lots of side meetings going on. Just another picture from a plenary session. So around 2009, with the terrible outcome in Copenhagen, there was a lot of acrimony, particularly from between China and the US, which both blamed each other for the failure of Copenhagen. George Monbiot, who I mentioned earlier, wrote, I don't really need to go to the article, but this was just an article at the time, "Climate change enlightenment was fun while it lasted, but now it's dead." And I don't need to go any further than the title here. So China and US blame each other in climate standoff. So the US basically said, because China won't commit to emissions reductions or any specific, constraints on emissions, we're not going to commit And China was saying, well, you've got massive, historical emissions far greater than us. We need to develop for our people, to lift our people out of poverty, and for our, development of our country, we're not going to agree to be restrained. You should be committing. So they both blamed each other. There were a lot of reasons why China was wary of an ambitious climate target. This is China's chief negotiator for many years. I don't want to dwell on that though, because as you know, we get up to Paris and the situation has changed. So then there was a series of meetings. So basically, terrible failure in 2009, and basically the China and the US clearly fighting with each other, not cooperating. Then there's a series of meetings where basically the global community tried to pick up the pieces. So the meeting in Cancun in 2010, COP16, another side meeting. Then Durban in 2011, and basically they started to have these terms like the Cancun agreements, the Durban platform, and they're basically trying to build up, from the rubble that was climate policy and international climate cooperation, from the absolute rubble that it was, they tried to basically build up something better. And this is Todd Stern was the US envoy on climate, and this is from 2011, but they were pretty well despondent, saying Kurd is dead, and basically also saying the 2-degree target, no one's basically pushing for that anymore. So the story continues through Doha, 2012, and the Warsaw the following year, COP19, again another meeting in Bonn, Lima in 2014, COP20, and so basically putting the pieces together, leading up to Paris. And the French, I've emphasised the US role and China. The French put a lot of diplomatic effort into this as well, into basically pushing for an agreement. But the foundation really was laid by Obama and China, and essentially having bilateral talks. Obama showing tremendous leadership, China showing tremendous leadership. In the lead up to Paris, China and the US had a bilateral agreement basically committing to emissions reductions. So the biggest two players agreeing and working together laid the foundation then for the global community to come together. But if you see the context where Obama knew that he could get nothing through the Senate, they weren't able to ratify Kyoto, so Obama needed to have something that didn't create legally binding commitments. So it meant that the whole basis for the Paris Agreement couldn't impose legal obligations on the parties. So, and because of the importance of the US to the overall regime, the success or failure of it, basically the global community went along with that. So a lot of countries were unhappy with it, but it was an essential component of any agreement that the US could sign up to, was that it didn't impose legally binding obligations. So in the lead up to Paris, the French and the Durban platform and the Warsaw agreement, all of those things led to countries submitting what were called INDCs, or intended nationally determined contributions. So instead of saying, what each country would have, they allowed the countries themselves to nominate what they would agree to do. So it was very much a bottom-up approach and a voluntary approach, on the understanding that let's get some agreement and look to ratchet up agreement over time, or build from it, because we've come from this disaster in Copenhagen. So when all of those elements coming together, the INDCs that had come in led to the Paris Agreement. And yeah, this is just was a screen grab. It's no longer on the UNFCCC website, but you can see they called things like the Bali Roadmap, the Cancun Agreements, the Durban Outcomes, the Doha Climate Gateway. They're all these lovely, funny metaphors, the Warsaw Outcomes, but they were all sort of stepping stones to the INDCs and a different approach, trying to avoid the failure of Copenhagen. So look, there's many critical reviews, blogs, publications on the status of the Paris Agreement. Look, you've heard my views. I think the world should be taking much stronger action than we currently are taking. At the same time, we have to deal with the real world, and in the real world, what was achieved in Paris was an amazing. We should celebrate what was achieved rather than be despondent about what wasn't achieved, because the world basically needed a shot in the arm for cooperating on climate, and it achieved it in Paris. So there's the political leadership. I mentioned Ban Ki-moon, the UN Secretary General, Christina Figueres, the Executive Secretary for the UNFCCC. They were both outstanding. Ban Ki-moon, the year before Paris, he held a leaders summit at the UN. Basically, I think we had Tony Abbott at the time. He refused to go, but basically every other leader. It was so petty. Our Prime Minister, Tony Abbott at the time, he happened to be I think he was in New York like 2 days before, but he didn't stick around for the Ban Ki-moon's high-level leaders summit. It was only like a question of 2 days or something, but he flew home. Anyway, that was Australia. But Ban Ki-moon, tremendous leadership. Obama and China, tremendous leadership. This is the UN high-level summit on the 23rd of September 2014. So trying to get the key leaders together, try and get consensus for then have them go back and direct their governments to act accordingly. So you can see here a quote from Ban Ki-moon. He warned that the dreams of humanity hang in the balance. To ride this storm, we need all hands on deck, he said. The human, environmental and financial cost of climate change is fast becoming unbearable. So he invested a lot in this. And so they were intended nationally determined contributions, or INDCs, and you can see them. So you can see here, this is the Chinese one on the 30th of June 2015. So this is in the lead up. So the conference was at the end of the year. So countries submitting their INDCs. And adjust. No, I thought I had saved one there, but I'll. Let's just go and have a look at what they look like, because these became then nationally determined contributions. So what country would we like to look at? Choose any country. Sorry?
I was going to say some like Indonesia, somewhere that's kind of like in the middle.
Okay, shall we go Indonesia? Just to see what they look like. So yeah, 170 parties have ratified of the 197 parties to the convention. That's the Paris Agreement. Paris Agreement decisions. So these are the decisions. So what do we want? Indonesia? So it's 19 pages long. First nationally determined contribution, Republic of Indonesia, November 2016. National context. Indonesia is a nascent yet stable democracy and fourth most populous country in the world. So, setting context. Estimates what their emissions are in 2005. It's voluntary pledges. Talks about RED+. And you can see here lots of references to ambition. What it's going to do in relation to adaptation. Talks about different laws related to it, strategic approach, planning processes, information, transparency. There's not a lot in these that are generally, they're meant to be, this is what we intend to do. They're not legally binding. They tend to set out, their context, range of different national laws, the different strategies they've got in place. So quite a typical sort of NDC. Get the idea? So you can go and look up, any country you like, and how they're reporting their emissions. There's a big emphasis on trying to be transparent. Reference there to the Sustainable Development Goals. So, a broad summary of what a country is doing in relation to mitigation, adaptation, references to strategies, some reference to transparency. That's what you'll find in most of the nationally determined contributions. They are vague, but they're the best. Well, that's essentially how what the Paris Agreement was built around. Countries saying what they are doing, what they're willing to do, and then the idea being that let's get a global consensus and let's build up support and ratchet up our commitments over time. And the huge thing that I think if you get too focused on the lack of commitments in the nationally determined contributions, you have to see in the context of what the disaster from 2009, the global acrimony, and just the lack of cooperation, to now at least there is a consensus around cooperation, subject to now Donald Trump arriving on the scene and trying to be like a bull in a china shop and wreck it. So I really would emphasise the positives with the Paris Agreement rather than the negatives. So when I've just put up the draft agreement here, just to give you an illustration of negotiations. Can you actually read that? See down the bottom? So this was the draft agreement that was released. So you can see there the ad hoc working group on the Durban platform for enhanced action. And it had the draft agreement and Article 2, the purpose. And paragraph 2, this is when they started the COP in Paris that ultimately resulted in the Paris Agreement. This was the form at the start of it. And this class was actually running, in 2015, it was actually running at the same time as the Paris Agreement was actually happening. So when we started, I think like on the Monday, we looked at the draft, and I said, and I was really surprised to see the reference to 1.5 degrees, because Europe had been pushing 2 degrees for ages, and a lot of people say even 2 degrees is virtually impossible to achieve. So when I saw 1.5 degrees, I was saying to the class, oh look, that'll be, that's bracketed, there's no way that'll be there at the end. That's just the AOSIS states pushing something. There's no way that, the US and others will agree to it. And then, of course, I had to eat my words. or basically say I was thrilled that I was wrong, because they ultimately kept in the 1.5 degrees. But certainly I didn't think it was going to be there when they started the negotiations. So this is the original, or the version at the start of the final negotiations in Paris. Parties recognise that deep cuts in global greenhouse emissions are urgently required, with a view to reducing such emissions so as to hold the increase in global average temperatures, and then square brackets, below 2 degrees, and then below 2 or 1.5 degrees above pre-industrial levels. So from that quote you saw before, if you've got something in square brackets in negotiations, it means that that is disputed. So they haven't resolved it. Anything that isn't in square brackets is basically set. The parties are happy with it. Okay, and then the final document that was adopted, this is Article 2. So at the end of the few weeks of negotiations in Paris, it set a hard target of 2 degrees and an aspirational target of 1.5. So you can see the form has changed quite considerably. And then it's 1A, that's the key bit. So they say holding the increase in global average temperatures to well below 2 degrees above pre-industrial levels, and to pursue efforts to limit the temperature increase to 1.5 degrees above pre-industrial levels, recognising that this would significantly reduce the risks and impacts of climate change. So yeah, I'm certainly really thrilled. I was certainly really thrilled to have the 1.5 target even mentioned, because yeah, the lower the better. You know, in a perfect world, I actually think 1 degree is the target that really we should be aiming for, but we're already at 1 degree. And so, you know, it would be overshoot and trying to get back to 1 degree. So that's the target, that's the Paris Agreement, and it's built around non-binding, nationally determined contributions. So each of the parties, basically, we don't need to look at the text of the Paris Agreement. Basically, there's the nationally determined contributions. Beyond looking at the objective, parties get to submit their nationally determined contributions. There's no binding component to the agreement. We know that, like, when you look at, even though what countries are committing at is fuzzy, basically their commitments, people that do modelling of commitments are saying that on current nationally determined contributions, if they were achieved, we'd have mean temperature rises of around 3.5 degrees by 2100. So even though the goal is 2 degrees, even if the nationally determined contributions are achieved, it's going to be well beyond 2 degrees. So we need to have higher ambition if we're going to achieve 2 degrees. But yeah, don't lose sight of what Paris agreed. I think don't get hung up on the negatives. This is a quote from Ban Ki-moon that I think is really significant. So this is just at the end of his 2 terms as UN Secretary General. So, you know, had been, you know, a leading negotiator for decades, and he says, I've been attending many difficult multilateral negotiations, but by any standard, this negotiation is most complicated, most difficult, but most important for humanity ever. That's what he said at the end of the Paris COP. And yeah, this was a quote that I thought was insightful. So since the Kyoto Protocol of 1997, the UNFCCC has failed to produce a comprehensive, legally binding agreement to reduce global emissions. Year after year, negotiators have gathered with little to show for their toil. Meanwhile, global greenhouse emissions have been rising. The Earth is getting warmer, and we have begun to feel the impact of frequent severe weather events. The Paris Agreement has ended the drought of multilateral action on climate change. Its meaning and impact will no doubt be debated in coming days and months. It is imperfect and should be strengthened with time. But don't underestimate the significance of this event for the trajectory of the multilateral system and humanity. I think that's really valuable to bear in mind. You know, don't get hung up on the negatives, because prior to Obama and China working together for a year leading up to Paris, global climate negotiations were just this wasteland of toil that was leading nowhere. So this is at least a light in that darkness. So the significance of the Paris Agreement goes well beyond climate change. It shows that multilateralism is alive and well, and that it can navigate a path through the stormiest weathers. Climate negotiators in Paris were just one moment in time, but it should give us hope in humanity's abilities to address the collective challenges that lie ahead. That might be going a little bit too exuberant, but you know, it is a really positive step. Okay, the Paris Agreement entered into force very quickly on the 4th of October. Must be 2016. Yeah, sorry, 5th of October 2016. I'll change that. I was just thinking to myself, how could it be like entered into force before it is even agreed? 4th of October, so within a year, it had entered into force. It now has, at that stage, 115 parties. It's now got 170 parties. So the following year, so countries now have agreed, but the nationally determined contributions are vague, and everyone agrees that they need to be ratcheted up. So it's going to be, you know, it's about implementing them, continuing to work together, continuing to cooperate. The next meeting was in Marrakech in Morocco. But the shadow that was cast over that meeting was, of course, Donald Trump had just been elected in the US. So he was president-elect. And at that stage, it was really unclear what he was going to do. So he'd obviously been, you know, throwing hand grenades around and all sorts of international agreements, you know, attacking Mexico, saying they were going to build a wall, you know, attacking you know, different countries. On climate, he was seemed to be a denier, but you know, Trump seems to, you know, live for the sort of TV reality show of drama. So he wants to keep everyone guessing. So there were, you know, comments where he denied climate change, and also comments where, you know, when he tried, news people tried to pin him down or something, he would say, oh, there's some connectivity between human activity and global warming. And he was saying at that stage that he was keeping an open mind. So there were all these news reports about whether Trump would stay in the Paris Agreement or not. And there was a lot of uncertainty at that COP meeting. But then in June of this year, the US, after, you know, more drama, you know, Trump sort of likes to have the, you know, the reveal or whatever. What do they call it in reality TV? You know, you build drama over the week. There's all these sort of stuff coming out. Will he do it? Won't he? Will he do it? Won't he? All these fighting, you know, infighting within the White House. And finally, it was announced that the US announced its intention to withdraw from the Paris Agreement. One significant thing is they haven't announced an intention to withdraw from the United Nations Framework Convention on Climate Change, so they're still going to be a party to the UNFCCC, but they have announced their intention to withdraw from the Paris Agreement. And under the Paris Agreement, it takes a couple of years. It's not just, but they've announced that they will do that. So the interesting thing, I think, is that basically now it's pretty clear that most global leaders are just completely pissed off at Trump. They just think he's an idiot. You see the latest spat over the last couple of days where Theresa May, the UK Prime Minister, basically told him to pull his head in about retweeting some far-right political group in the UK with some, was it anti-Muslim videos or something, and just saying that that was the wrong thing to do, and then Trump attacked her. I mean, it's just crazy, you know, like one of your closest allies, and anyway, he's attacking her. So obviously, a lot of the global leaders have decided, you know, he's he, has to be managed, that he's unreliable, he'll do anything, and they're sick of him. So it's really clear that the world is trying to get on with dealing with climate change despite the US. So whereas a year ago there was this great uncertainty, now the world knows that US is going to withdraw. There's not this flood of countries also seeking to withdraw. There's still countries still sticking with it. So I think I've summarised it in for you as my view is clearly the US is hampering climate policy, but it hasn't destroyed it. And the response to climate change is going to outlive the Trump administration, subject to him blowing us all up with North Korea. So assuming we don't have nuclear war, his presidency is going to end, and there is still going to be a climate regime in place. And hopefully, the next US president will be someone like Barack Obama, who's inspiring, drives for action. It's not the end of this regime. So the most recent COP has just been held. You might have seen it a bit in the news. I put a few news stories about it on the discussion board. Not a lot to report from it. Countries are reporting on their efforts. It's about cooperation. There's a lot of positive spin in the communiques about it. The US presented, did anyone see the reports about the US presenting a pro-coal? They got heckled. The US had a pro-coal presentation at the climate conference and got roundly heckled by members of the audience. So yeah, the world's getting on with it despite. Okay, so key point, Trump hasn't derailed the Paris Agreement. The lack of US participation certainly hampers global efforts, but the US is isolated on this issue. Isolated. And the rest of the world is not walking away from the Paris Agreement. So yeah, the Paris Agreement isn't perfect. It's too weak, needs to be stronger, but it's a hell of a lot better than the alternative that we had just a few years ago. So it is a step forward, and it is a sign of hope. And it's also sending really important economic signals for investment. So for banks, if you're a bank, think about it this way. The global community sent this really important message about where it intends to go, and you're a bank and you're thinking to invest $10 billion, say, in the Adani coal mine. That mine is going to be there for 60 years and produce a massive amount of coal. The international community is saying, basically, we need to move out of fossil fuels really quickly. So, do you invest $10 billion when the payback is going to be over 20 or 30 years before you even get your money back? Is that a wise investment decision? So the Paris Agreement is significant for a lot of big investment decisions. And even though coal mines are still going ahead, coal-fired power stations are still going ahead, it's certainly a brake on them. So it is important. Any thoughts? What do you guys think? You've been, seeing the news, seeing all of this stuff. What do you think of the Paris Agreement? Am I just putting too much, I've obviously when I talked about the UNFCCC and coral reefs, I'm very critical of the lack of action. So does it seem strange that I'm standing here and saying that this is a positive step forward? Yeah.
I guess it's still better than nothing, and at the same time, the reason that people sign on to these things is because they think it's achievable, and once again, it's non-binding.
Yep.
So if it becomes binding, people aren't going to sign up for it. And if there's actually a quantifiable amount, they're saying you have to do this,
yep,
people once again aren't going to sign up to it.
Yep.
So there's a balance between trying to find an amount that will actually have an impact in
yep
regards to being too high and people don't really want to try.
Yep.
So with Kyoto, they kind of went we're going to keep it a little bit easy for you, I feel, but at least that way they're getting people involved.
Yes. Any other comments? That's very insightful and deserves a chocolate. Sorry, I had to go because there's this. I think I should have logged it. Any other comments?
I think the non-binding is really indicative of global government in the sense that now that you signed up to a non-binding agreement, but now it's down to another seesaw of whether your own national government decides to implement it or not.
Yep.
So here, we'll never have a Liberal government that will really commit to.
So the non-binding nature of it was probably essential for
I
getting
get
any
that,
sort of consensus?
I get that too. It just seems really indicative of the flimsy nature of
Yep.
it all.
With the non-binding thing, I think it's really interesting you mentioned Barack Obama really wanted it to be non-binding so that America would get involved, and now America's pulling out. It's like all that effort kind of, it seems a bit wasted. But I know everyone else is still involved, and it being non-binding probably helps a lot of other countries, but it's like, oh, why do you even bother with America anymore? They just don't care. Obviously.
Yeah. There's no doubt that, Trump's actions are,
I think most of the world does look down on how Trump is acting and how he's doing this, but that can actually be kind of good because I guess no one else really wants to be looked down as people looking down on the US. Like if Trump's going to do something this idiotic, most other countries are probably going to say, well, I'm not that bad, and you don't want people to think about you that way. It's a huge reputation.
And also with the US too, it's such a massive place with, California, for instance, is very proactive on climate change. California, if it was a country, it would be the 6th biggest economy, wouldn't it? It's like a massive economy in its own right. And, it's very strong on climate action. So, you've got many climate leaders in the US, obviously, say Tesla, as a US company, and, the things that they're doing. So the US still has an important leadership role, even if the federal government is hampering him. Yeah. Other thoughts?
I think the fact that it's non-binding is what is like the real difference with bringing about change, because it's non-binding when people can be like, yeah, I agree with it, but they don't really have to put in any action to live up to their words.
Yeah, it does make sense as to why you get agreement.
Anyone can be like, yeah, I agree with it, but they don't, because it's not binding, they don't really have to do anything to prove that.
Yes, whether it's any better than just business as usual, whether because it's just voluntary measures and a lot of these things countries were going to do anyway. But, when you look at them collectively, like on that, the business as usual, so business as usual is worse than what the nationally determined contributions will give us. So, that's the blue line, just doing things as, so it is better than nothing, but it's just not enough. And I suppose this graph, I think, is a really good way or segue into me saying, re-emphasising, when you think about effectiveness of environmental policy, it's not black and white. So there's, a range of, it's never going to be 100% successful or hopefully never 100% failure. So this is, a sort of middle between great success and great failure. Obviously it should be better. And even, I've emphasised, even at 2 degrees, we won't have coral reefs. So even 2 degrees is inadequate. But, the alternatives, at 2 degrees, yes, we won't have coral reefs, but hopefully humanity will still, we will still have a civilization that is generally at peace. Because obviously one of the huge problems is climate change occurs is you lose productive areas, the threat of armed conflict between countries over scarce resources becomes phenomenally higher, and climate refugees, the threat that civilization could essentially, dissolve into, mass war with refugees, flooding. So, like we see in Europe. So the Syrian conflict driving, a mass flood of refugees into Europe. Replicate that over multiple spheres around the planet, and the threat to the global community is acute. So, yeah. I see it's just on 1 o'clock. I'm going to go on to talk about the future, but I think that that's probably a good point for us to pause and take a break for lunch, and we'll come back and we'll talk about the future. Also want to talk a bit about your futures and where you see yourselves as part of that. So why don't we take a break for an hour? Hey, welcome back to our lecture on the Paris Agreement. So just before we break for lunch, we had reached the point of going briefly through the agreement, looking at the objective, the 2 degrees, or if possible less than 1.5 degrees, and then we looked at a nationally determined contribution from Indonesia just as an example. You can get all of them on the website. They're non-binding, and then we looked at the consequence of Trump announcing that in the middle of this year that the US would withdraw from the Paris Agreement. And there was just a nice question in the break about why couldn't Trump proceed straight away, and we looked at the Paris Agreement, and in Article 28 it says that essentially withdrawal, a country can withdraw after 3 years, 3 years after it has ratified the agreement. So essentially there's a 3-year window or period, sort of a cooling off period, or basically we're locked into it. Trump could have, under that provision, withdrawn from the Framework Convention totally and done that immediately, but he's chosen not to do that. So it's, I've seen commentary saying, well, that's a positive that it didn't withdraw, or the US hasn't withdrawn from the entire Framework Convention. I'd say from the US's perspective, it's still important to have a seat at the table, but it's likely to play that sort of spoiler role. So instead of leadership, as we talked about in relation to international negotiations, we shouldn't assume that countries are there negotiating in good faith, like Saudi Arabia can go in and just basically try and delay and hamper any agreements being reached. So the US is not going to play a leadership role. It still will be involved in meetings, likely for the foreseeable future, to really just be hampering rather than assisting. So the leadership really, Europe and China are really keys for leading the ambition. So obviously groups like AOSIS also want to lead, but they're so economically small that they don't have the power to really push an agenda. And also country, like a group like Europe has some money potentially that it can give to incentivize actions. So Europe plays a really important role in all of this. Okay, so Trump hasn't derailed the Paris Agreement, certainly hampers it, but the US appears very isolated on this issue as well as others, and the rest of the world isn't walking away from the Paris Agreement. So questions that arise, I think, are, this one's particularly important. Will China emerge as the global climate leader in the wake of Trump's election? And can I just suggest that we, I think it's so easy, like being an Australian, where we get, saturated with, our news media, where we're very focused on the US and Europe. China, we know, has emerged. It's our biggest trading partner now, but the inherent blinkers of our culture, seeing the US as a leader. Obviously, China is continuing to emerge. Sure, there are some issues that we disagree with China on, like the South China Sea, but we need to also be open to seeing China not as a threat, but as a real leader in this area. So the potential that China, and I know we've got many Chinese students in the course, and you might have your own view on, I'm sure you have your own view on, government in China and how successful it'll be, all the problems it has, internally. It's not, China certainly has its plenty of internal issues like any country, but it's a global superpower now. It sees climate from a number of perspectives. There's the domestic pressure to address massive pollution in its cities. There's also the economic opportunity to basically be the dominant industrial hub for the manufacture of new technologies like solar, like wind. So if it can dominate in those areas, it's an immense economic opportunity for China. So there's really seem to be those two major drivers for China continuing to play a leadership role, as well as also the reputational aspect, because there's always been the hard power component of military might for countries like the US or Great Britain or Russia, but there's the soft power element as well, which is the respect that countries have for you, for your culture, your standing. So the US, so film industry has been a big part of its soft power, its ability to influence. So countries respecting and admiring China for what it's achieving, it can exercise soft power. So will China, so Trump's walking away from essentially climate action, but they're also walking away from an immense economic opportunity. And that's that's where it hurts the US. It's not helping the US. So will China emerge? So obviously Europe is a leader now. Europe's got its own problems with Brexit, refugee crisis. Where will China position itself in the coming decades? Did I put this up earlier? I can't remember if I did. I just liked it. It was an article from last year. I thought it summarised a lot of issues. For China, multiple factors came together between Copenhagen and Paris. China's growth was slowing, and its leaders understood from the examples of South Korea and Japan that their economy needed to be more efficient in its use of energy and resources, and it needed to upgrade its capacity to produce advanced, high-value technologies, preferably with China owning the patents if it was to avoid stagnation. By the time of the 13th five-year plan in 2015, it was clear that China's leadership had identified low-carbon technologies as the technologies of the future. And since these were new technological frontiers, there was an opportunity for China to establish its dominance as an innovator as well as a manufacturer and exporter. For China, the opportunities that tackling climate offered began to be seen as an engine of the next phase of prosperity. Last year, China invested $102 billion in renewable energy and installed half of the world's new wind power. It is still highly dependent on coal, but its coal consumption has peaked and begun to decline, to be replaced over time by renewables, hydro and nuclear power. So that's not like a rosy, let's do good for the world approach. There's a pragmatic reason, and that's actually, that pragmatic reason is a real reason for hope. You don't have to be, starry-eyed about it, that China's going to do it for the good of the world. China is acting in its own self-interest in many ways, and those self-interests happen to align with positive action on climate change, which is good for all of us. So that's, your thoughts on that? And particularly from China, if you've got a view on, how real you think it is. I mean, China's such an immense country, so obviously it's impossible to, speak on behalf of an entire country, but, if anyone's got a different perspective to me, happy to hear it.
I think not only respond to the climate change. I think first, after looking you mentioned before, we have to do some actions to tackling pollution.
Yep.
So it's the internal driver for us to improve our air quality and water quality.
Yes.
It's very important for us, for our citizens.
Yep. So pollution control is a massive driver. Just seems really apparent, you know, like the pollution levels just seem phenomenally bad. And that must just be, like, I can't imagine being in a city where if you went outside and you could hardly breathe or couldn't see, you know, the buildings. And there just must be such an immense pressure from people for the government to respond. So you think that that's a massive driver? Good. Okay, well, if there's no more comments on that, I'll keep moving along. But just, can I just emphasise, I think it's really important for people obviously people from China have a perspective and hope that, you know, China will move forward as, you know, be a dominant force for, you know, in this coming century. But I really think it's important, say, for us in Australia and other countries to also recognise the opportunities for this and not to have the assumption that the US will be the leader forever or even now. And there are other, you know, as opposed to, say, Russia, which is, you know, the sort of you know, the corruption in Russia just seems to have very little hope that Russia won't just act in, you know, a very selfish way. You know, it's not going to emerge as a positive leader, I don't think. Whereas I think that there's real hope for China in this instance, particularly because it's got its own domestic pressure to deal with pollution. So, okay, will China and EU form a climate bloc? This is an article in the Conversation saying why China and Europe should form the world's most powerful climate bloc. You know, more a question than a suggestion that they will. Yeah, the world needs China's ongoing leadership on climate change. Okay, so we're here now. We have this hampering effect from Trump and the US. We know that the world is still soldiering on and trying to respond. What does the future hold? Like, what can we think can logically happen from this point? If the world continues to address climate change through the Paris Agreement, is it going to be a smooth future where we gradually deal with this problem and technology catches up and, you know, hopefully we avoid the worst instances? Or will it be disaster driven like we've seen with MARPOL and some other conventions? You know, are we in that sort of regime? Is that what we should expect? Or, you know, is it like the Vienna Convention, you know, where we've got an effective framework and we can expect a recovery and relatively smooth where we can transition out of ozone depleting substances? So what do you guys think of those two, disaster driven or a smooth transition where we avoid the worst? So who's for disaster driven? So I think that's about 50%. And who's for a smooth gradual improvement? So I think about 30 or 40%, and some who didn't vote. Okay. When we think to the future, you can actually find there's a whole, you know, realm of people who, you know, gaze to the future. This was just an example of one. The CSIRO, Australian Research Organisation, had a Our Future World report where they talked about things like, you know, increasing globalization, population growth, increasing efficiencies, those sorts of issues, and they were trying to identify needs for more science research. That was what that report was about. But if I like the pressure state response framework as a nice logical way to look at, you know, evaluate the effectiveness of our current response. So if we use that, and so that's where we, you know, look at the pressure, you know, our current emissions, what's the state? We know greenhouse gases are rising, we know global temperatures are rising, we know there's a whole range of bad impacts. You know, including, it looks like Melbourne's going to be, you know, this weekend. All the reports are saying this is a massive storm that's coming. What's driving that storm? Does anyone know what's driving the storm that's going to hit Melbourne? Really hot sea temperatures, basically south of Australia. Really, really unusually hot sea temperatures. So there's a climate change component in that. So yeah, Melbourne's going to get a bucket of rain. They're just, you know, I'm sure you've all seen the news. This weekend there's going to be massive flooding in Victoria, and then it'll probably come up into New South Wales. So extreme weather. So we know that the state is affected now by climate change. We've seen, you know, that data I showed you yesterday with the Northern Hemisphere change in temperature distribution, that whole shift. So we see these extremes coming. We know that the impacts are hitting us now and are going to continue. So the state is declining, and so we then ask about, well, the response. So the Paris Agreement and everything that nations are doing, we know that it's inadequate to even achieve 2 degrees, and we know at 2 degrees is going to be really bad impacts. So we're at 1 degree now. So in evaluating the response, you can ask, well, is the current response likely to alleviate the pressure enough to protect the state? And you know, it's, the answer to that would be clearly not. That the response is inadequate, so it's not going to be effective. So we know that, yeah, the pressure, we're burning a huge amount of fossil fuels. We're causing increased global temperatures, ocean acidification. We talked about those sorts of impacts. We know that the current response is inadequate to even achieve 2 degrees. So what does the future hold? Well, the future holds pretty clearly that we won't have coral reefs. We won't have an Arctic, we won't have coral reefs. There doesn't appear to be any real reason to expect anything else. There will be patches of reefs that survive, but not anything like the Great Barrier Reef that we have now. And also the Arctic, there's no reason to expect that the Arctic will be there within our lifetimes, like Arctic sea ice. So that, you know, summer will be essentially no Arctic sea ice. So those things are all logical projections from where we're at now. So in terms of achieving the objective of the UNFCCC, well, if we look at the qualitative objective in Article 2, we're not achieving that. We're not avoiding dangerous climate change. If we lose the Arctic, we lose coral reefs. Clearly, we're not allowing ecosystems to adapt naturally, and we're also hugely damaging food production. Coral reefs produce a huge amount of food for, you know, so many countries, and yeah, economic development isn't proceeding in a sustainable manner. So we're breaching all of the criteria for Article 2. John Podesta said this. He was speaking about Canadian policies on tar sands and climate change, but it applies to us. I just think it's a really good metaphor. At the moment, we're absurdly trying to ride 2 horses galloping in opposite directions. We're trying to address climate change at the same time we're trying to dig up and burn all our fossil fuels, and they're just going in opposite directions. So, yeah, Hansen, I said this to you guys already, but you know, his point, preservation of a climate resembling that to which humanity is accustomed requires that most remaining fossil fuel carbon is never emitted to the atmosphere, and yet if you were to walk into any politician in Australia, into their office, and leaving aside the Greens and let's say any government officer, minister, so that leaves aside, you know, opposition parties. If you were to walk in and say, Australia has to leave all of our fossil fuels, you know, the bulk of our fossil fuels have to be left in the ground, even though that's scientifically accurate, they are going to call security and have you taken away because there's a mad person in their room. Like, that's the reaction you'll get, you know, that you are nuts. before I get to hope, you know, my thought on the, you know, the idea of disaster-driven or, you know, a smooth gradual improvement, you know, basically, do we have a comprehensive regime like the Vienna Convention, you know, for ozone? Clearly no, we don't have that. And it doesn't look like we're going to get that under, you know, current politics. In fact, we're going in the opposite direction with Trump. So pretty clearly, we're in the Marpole sort of situation, like when the Torrey Canyon has run aground. It's been a disaster, but we're not willing yet to take action. So my view is that current policies are inadequate. What we'll see is big jumps. It won't be smooth. So there'll be disasters driving rapid change in policy. And it's really difficult to foresee what our policies will become because we'll get desperate. And so now, at the moment, it looks like no one is saying keep fossil fuels in the ground, but that will come because there won't be a choice. That's my thought. I don't know when that will be, but it doesn't, to me, there doesn't seem to be any other alternative. Your thoughts? You can challenge me on that if you want. If you think that there's, by all means, I'm happy to be dissuaded. And I don't want to leave it there, though. I don't want to see it as a negative. So what will climate policy look like in 2050? I don't know. It is going to be radically different to what we've got now. So 2050 is, all you young'uns, this is your working life. So what is climate policy going to look like at the end of your working life? We don't know, because it's going to radically change. Hopefully, we'll be able to avoid the worst impacts. It'll be radically different. We don't know what it will be, though. And in that context, I want to talk about hope, because the future is like, this jigsaw that we're building up a picture of. So we don't know what the solution is yet. We don't even have all of the pieces of our jigsaw, but we're assembling it. We're building the future. So this was a little animation, actually, that I got with the Al Gore climate presentation. And in the animation, they actually all come together. But I actually like them separate, because it looks too neat when they all come together. I like this because you can sort of see Australia there and the pieces are all apart. We really don't, we want to put them all together. We don't know how. So I've made this point already. There is good news. We are achieving sustainable development in some aspects, and so keep in mind the ozone regime and how the world has avoided catastrophe in that area. So there's a huge success there. Don't lose sight of the positives. And I also spoke about this yesterday in the context of sustainable development. We're not solving climate change and ocean acidification because we haven't convinced the majority of people that we have a really big problem. But also the second part is really important, that we have solutions. And there's a positive alternative future without burning fossil fuels that maintains jobs, homes, food supply and comparable lifestyles or acceptable restrictions in lifestyles. And I think that second component is really important to continue to convey. Just like China is seeing there's an opportunity to address climate change, in Australia and other countries, there's, think about the research, for folks that want to go on and do a PhD or something, research in climate policies, in, new technology, whatever you're going to work in, there's work in this. There's an incredible number of jobs, economic growth, just so many opportunities. It's not just a threat. And we need to provide positive solutions to address climate change. So, everyone loves, well, unless some people hate wind farms. I think they're really, really nice, but yeah, we need to recognise positive solutions, not just the problem. So the positives. And celebrate positive solutions. So these Japanese inventors, and the work they did to, to produce LED lights that now are ubiquitous and has saved something like 20% of global electricity usage is saved now due to this, this invention. It's a massive, massive component, and we all have one of those, in your pocket, in your mobile phone, or LED lights. This was just another picture of a positive story I saw. Ultra-fast charging batteries that could be 70% recharged in just 2 minutes. Scientists at Nanyang Technological University in Singapore have developed a new battery that can be recharged up to 70% in only 2 minutes. The battery will also have a longer lifespan of over 20 years. So I don't know whether that's going to eventually be, whether that'll turn out to be right, but celebrate them, that sort of innovation. So, yeah, whole range of advances in producing renewable technology, and also make the point, this is one that Joe Ron on Climate Progress makes, a writer I really like. He constantly gives the message, we can't just wait for technology to deliver a magic bullet. That's not the answer. You need to deploy, deploy, deploy. And deploying things brings down the price. So here we've got price of solar panels from 1977 and just plummeting down to current prices. So thanks to a quarter century of deployment policies, basically solar panels have dropped in price a staggering 99%, and can be complete with grid power. And can compete with grid power unsubsidised in many countries around the world. So we need bold ideas. I mentioned this one also in an early lecture. It was Zero Carbon Australia. You can still download it. It was produced a few years ago by a group at Melbourne University, and they proposed a 10-year plan to repower Australia completely with renewable energy, including solar, wind, a whole range of different technologies. And they had it priced and, put out, the cost was going to be, I think it was like something like $40 or $50 billion, which is a lot of money, but it's also similar to what we're spending on the internet, the National Broadband Network failure. And also, like at the last election, the Turnbull government just found $60 billion to build 12 submarines. So, it's not like the money that they were talking about was something that was just so outrageously expensive that no one could ever contemplate it. We can find it for 12 submarines. Why can't we find it to just basically pay for a future that, sees, Australia is seen as a leader in renewable energy? And yeah, so bold ideas. Germany has its massive energy transition program. So it, has had bold ideas. It's a leader in Europe. I mentioned this quote as well in this book by Van Jones, an American or a US writer. To succeed, environmental programs must be linked to jobs and poverty alleviation. Because if we just talk about the cute and cuddly animals and the saving the world for the sake of saving the world, we don't get enough people interested. So you have to link it to jobs and poverty alleviation to have the public support. So ensure that laws and policies create jobs and social benefits. This was just a picture of a farmer who was carbon credits. So I spoke to you about this article I wrote about environmental protection being a job, the environmental protection industry being a job creator. So I just can't emphasise enough, I think that's such an important message, and empowering people. So we need to support politicians and strong leaders who call for action on climate change. So obviously Barack Obama no longer president of the US, but this was something he said in 2014. For all the immediate challenges that we gather to address this week, terrorism, instability, inequality, disease, there's one issue that will define the contours of this century more dramatically than any other, and that is the urgent and growing threat of a changing climate. and when he was here at UQ, so he spoke, you might recall the context. So there was a G20 meeting here in Australia, and Tony Abbott was the host, the Prime Minister at the time, so he was very anti-Australia. Under him was very anti-taking action on climate change. And Australia had fought against putting anything about climate change in the agenda at the G20. So Barack Obama, being a Barack Obama and the President of the US, arranged to give a speech here at UQ, down in the UQ hall. You can see all the UQ logos there, where he basically spoke about climate change. So basically it was like he went off reservation and just broke out from the G20 and went and just gave a speech to the public where he spoke about something that wasn't on the agenda at the G20. And it was clearly a quite pointed snub at the Australian government for refusing, basically fighting against having it on the agenda. And he said, "But let me say, particularly again to the young people here, combating climate change cannot be the work of governments alone. Citizens, especially the next generation, you have to keep raising your voices because you deserve to live your lives in a world that is cleaner and that is healthier and that is sustainable, and that is not going to happen unless you are heard." On energy sources and climate change, it is so important for the next generation to be able to step up and say, no, it doesn't have to be this way. You have the power to imagine a new future in a way that some of the older folks don't always have. No challenge poses a greater threat to our future and future generations than the change in climate. We only get one home. We only get one planet. There is no plan B. Okay, crashing back to Earth. Trump and the US announcing its intention to withdraw from the Paris Agreement in June 27 has hampered, but it hasn't derailed the global momentum that Obama, created. So this is a quote from 2009 from the Chinese Premier at the time. "Climate change is one of the serious challenges to human survival and development, and international cooperation is the key to tackling this challenge." So, and still reflected now in the Chinese leadership's statements. So, you must be the change you want to see in the world. And inspiring, social changes of the past are good to draw upon. So, Nelson Mandela's statement, "Every important change in history that was impossible until it happened." I really like Joanna Macy's work. She wrote about despair and empowerment in the nuclear age particularly, and she's really famous for that work. So if if these are issues that you struggle with, highly recommend Joanna Macy's work, because she says it's rational to despair in the face of the crises facing the Earth, but we can move beyond acceptance of that to work for positive change despite the potential for failure. In her active hope is a practice which sustains active hope is, one, take a clear view of reality. So we've got a big problem. It's a clear view of reality. And it doesn't look like it's, it looks bad from here. Identify our vision for what we hope will happen. Well, for me, I want there to be coral reefs. Simple as that. Save the Great Barrier Reef. Simple vision. Take active steps to help bring about that vision. For me, I think look at the skill. Look at the skill set you've got, and how you can put your career to achieving that vision. So you mightn't. Basically, even if you've got blunt tools, strike out with them. So for me, I'm a lawyer. My approach is find a coal mine and sue it. So I've spent 10 years suing or being involved in litigation against coal mines. And we've lost a lot. Lost a lot more than we've won. But I think make life bloody hard for the bastards. Hope is an essential part of success. Despair and denial have the common outcome of inaction. We don't take action because if we despair, the problem is hopeless, and if we deny it's a problem, we don't accept it is a problem that needs addressing. So don't despair, don't deny the problem, stay somewhere in between. And recognise that people need to live, have jobs, be fed and safe, but also, yeah, we need an inspiring picture for the future. And I want to inspire you with this amazing woman from the Marshall Islands. This lady was chosen to give, she's a spoken word poet, and she presented at the high-level summit for leaders that the UN Secretary General Ban Ki-moon held in 2014, so a year before the Paris Agreement. This is the one that Tony Abbott skipped town to avoid, and it's a short poem. She gives a little speech, but the poem is to her baby.
Our next speaker was selected from more than 500 candidates to represent the voice of civil society. From the Marshall Islands, please welcome Kathy Jatnil Kitchener.
Yaweko Mode. My family and I have traveled a long way to be here today, all the way from the Marshall Islands. The Marshall Islands encompasses more than 2 million square kilometers of ocean, and so it makes sense that our culture is one of voyaging and navigation. One of our most beloved legends features a canoe race between 10 brothers. Their mother, holding a heavy bundle, begged each of her sons for a ride on their canoe. But only the youngest listened and took her along for the ride, not knowing that his mother was carrying the first sail. With the sail, he won the race and became chief. The moral of the story is to honor your mother and the challenges life brings. Climate change is a challenge that few want to take on, but the price of inaction is so high. Those of us from Oceania are already experiencing it firsthand. We've seen waves crashing into our homes and our breadfruit trees wither from the salt and drought. We look at our children and wonder how they will know themselves or their culture should we lose our islands. Climate change affects not only us islanders, it threatens the entire world. To tackle it, we need a radical change in course. This isn't easy, I know. It means ending carbon pollution within my lifetime. It means supporting those of us most affected to prepare for unavoidable climate impacts. And it means taking responsibility for irreversible loss and damage caused by greenhouse gas emissions. The people who support this movement are Indigenous mothers like me, families like mine, and millions more, standing up for the changes needed and working to make them happen. I ask world leaders to take us all along on your ride. We won't slow you down. We'll help you win the most important race of all, the race to save humanity. I would now like to share with you a poem that I have written for my daughter, Matafele Beno. Dear Matafele Beno, you are a 7-month-old sunrise of gummy smiles. You are bald as an egg and bald as the Buddha. You are thighs that are thunder, shrieks that are lightning, so excited for bananas, hugs, and our morning walks along the lagoon. Dear Matafele Beno, I want to tell you about that lagoon. That lazy, lounging lagoon, lounging against the sunrise. Men say that one day, that lagoon will devour you. They say it will gnaw at the shoreline, chew at the roots of your breadfruit trees, gulp down rows of seawalls, and crunch through your island's shattered bones. They say you, your daughter, and your granddaughter too, will wander, rootless, with only a passport to call home. Dear Matafele Beno, don't cry. Mommy promises you, no one will come and devour you. No greedy whale of a company sharking through political seas. No backwater bullying of businesses with broken morals. No blindfolded bureaucracies gonna push this mother ocean over the edge. No one's drowning, baby. No one's moving. No one's losing their homeland. No one's becoming a climate change refugee. Or should I say, no one else. To the Carteret Islanders of Papua New Guinea and to the Taro Islanders of Fiji, I take this moment to apologize to you. We are drawing the line here because we, baby, are going to fight. Your mommy, daddy, boo-boo, Jima, your country, and your president too, we will all fight. And even though there are those hidden behind platinum titles who like to pretend that we don't exist, who like to pretend that the Marshall Islands, Tuvalu, Kiribati, Maldives, Typhoon Haiyan in the Philippines, floods of Algeria, Colombia, Pakistan, and all the hurricanes, earthquakes, and tidal waves didn't exist? Still, there are those who see us, hands reaching out, fists raising up, banners unfurling, megaphones booming, and we are canoes blocking coast ships. We are the radiance of solar villages. We are the fresh, clean soil of the farmers past. We are teenagers blooming petitions. We are families biking, recycling, reusing, engineers building, dreaming, designing, artists painting, dancing, writing, and we are spreading the word. And there are thousands out on the streets, marching hand in hand, chanting for change now. And they're marching for you, baby. They're marching for us. Because we deserve to do more than just survive. We deserve to thrive. Dear Mata Filipino, your eyes heavy with drowsy weight. So just close those eyes and sleep in peace. Because we won't let you down. You'll see.
What a cool lady, hey? And there's so much we can learn from her. We need to fight for the future that we want. You know, being nice, expecting others to be reasonable, and then our governments will take action necessary to prevent climate change, it's not working. So, obviously this quote from Winston Churchill from the lead up to World War II, "We shall defend our island, whatever the cost may be. We shall fight on the beaches. We shall fight on the landing grounds. We shall fight in the fields and in the streets, and we shall fight in the hills. We shall never surrender." So, you know, fighting in this context doesn't mean acts of aggression, but what I'm saying is refusing to passively accept unacceptable outcomes. You know, why should you passively accept the death of the Great Barrier Reef? And actively work to avoid those outcomes through non-violent, political, public, personal actions available to you. So don't accept unacceptable behaviour or government policies. Okay, fighting can also be fun. So this was this great cartoon of Tony Abbott, was our Prime Minister at the time in 2014, so fossil fool. He did have big ears too. And combining humour and facts can be powerful. So this was a report by the Australia Institute, "The Mouse That Roars, Coal in the Queensland Economy," making the point that coal is actually a really small part of our economy. The industry sells itself as this, you know, absolute essential component, but actually did you know the government earns more from vehicle registrations than it does in royalties from the coal industry? So it's actually, you know, 7% of gross state product. So do not accept that working to protect the environment against large development is anti-jobs or illegitimate as well. I think that that's something I'd say, because I've made this point that, you know, jobs and employment and housing, they're all outcomes that we want. Protecting the environment is essential for them. So this is a report from the World Bank in 2014, Climate Smart Development. So, you know, we need to communicate these things really clearly, articulately, and combine good imagery. So this, you can see here adding up the benefits of action that help build prosperity, end poverty, and combat climate change. So lives saved, jobs created, crops protected, energy saved, GDP increased, emissions reduced. So all positive messages, and again, built not just around saving, you know, plants and animals, but jobs, human health, all of these things, security, all of those are really good and important messages. It's a really good example of combining all of those things. So one thing that I've learned is that working in opposition to things like large coal mines is often seen as illegitimate. And you know, people that view all economic growth and private profits as fundamentally good and legitimate, in, you know, the opposite of, you know, so if you're fighting against a project like that. And the implicit question is, you know, why are you stopping us having jobs? And I think that's a wrong question. So, you know, for me personally, I'm not against people having jobs, and I really support that. What I oppose is jobs that destroy our planet. And yeah, I don't think you should be ashamed. I'm certainly not ashamed of working for protecting my kids' future, and you shouldn't be either. So I'm not ashamed, and you shouldn't be, for working to protect the places that you love. Places as magical as the Great Barrier Reef, or wherever you love. So in your career, don't be an ideological warrior. Be a critical thinker and stay open to changing your views based on new evidence. So, you know, don't accept anything I say without thinking critically about it. But also don't accept unacceptable behaviour or outcomes, like the loss of coral reefs, as economically rational. Yeah, we and our kids don't have a plan B or a planet B to go to. You know, this is where all of human history has occurred, and for all we know, this is where the rest of humanity is going to live out its entire existence. Yeah, I don't need to go into ecocide. I was thinking to do it, but I think it's an idea that's been proposed of a new international crime equivalent to genocide as ecocide. It's proposed by an amazing UK writer and lawyer, Polly Higgins. You can look at it on the website. She has proposed this as a future important step in human rights. It has very little support, globally from major governments. So it's not like it's going to happen. I think that it's a worthy idea to think about, but we fundamentally have to work with the system we've got right now, inadequate as it is, and work with whatever skills you've got. Okay, to wrap up, in this lecture we've talked about participating in international negotiations, the UN Sustainable Development Goals, the Paris Agreement, and also what the future will hold. So in summary, international negotiations involve many thousands of ordinary people working on behalf of their countries in many fields, and you could be part of them in the future. Second, international negotiations can be dominated by key parties such as the USA, as well as voting blocs of countries such as the G77 and China. The third point I'd make in summary is the UN Sustainable Development Goals 2015 provide important international policy commitments, so they're classic soft law guidance. Fourthly, current international commitments following the Paris Agreement will not avoid dangerous climate change, such as loss of coral reefs. The future climate policy will evolve rapidly, driven by rapid improvements in technology such as batteries, but also responses to disaster similar to MARPOL 73, 78. And in the face of all of this and the damage that we're going to see, we need to maintain hope and provide positive solutions to address climate change, and we need to fight for our climate and the future we want. So, it's the end of the lecture.